This is an example of calculating relative frequency and predicted outcomes of larger groups of people based on an experiment or a survey that was conducted. The survey was 40 people picked at random, and they were asked where they were born. The results were coded as follows in this box. The place of birth: people that were born in Hobart gave the answer 1. People that were born elsewhere in Tas gave the answer of number 2. People that gave an answer of number 3 were born interstate, and those who answered 4 were people that were born overseas. This table here contains the responses of people from the survey. So the first person answered number 1, which meant they were born in Hobart. The second person answered with the number 3, which meant they were born interstate. The next person answered with a number 2, which meant they were born elsewhere in Tasmania. 2 more 1s, 2 more people born in Hobart, followed by 4, which means born overseas. So first, we need to organise this data into a frequency table. I've prepared a frequency table here that we can use to tally up the responses. So our first response was Hobart, so that's 1 for the Hobart tally. 3, interstate. 2, other in Tas. 1, 1. I'm just going to pause the video and finish tallying that up, and we can have a look at what to do next. I've finished tallying up all of that data into the tally column, and now we can fill in the frequency column. We have 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 people were born in Hobart. We have 9 people born other places in Tasmania, 10 people born interstate, and 7 people born overseas. We can calculate the total of all of those frequencies. 14 plus 9 is 23, 33, and that gives us 40, which makes sense because 40 people were interviewed. Now, we don't need these 2 columns yet. Really, it's a frequency table with the place of birth, tally, and frequency column, but I've added these extra columns for our next part in the questions. So the next part is to find the relative frequency of each category as both a fraction and as a decimal. So let's do the fractions column first. Our frequency is our frequency is 14 out of a total 40. But you remember that we have to give our relative frequency as a simplest form fraction. So as a simplest form fraction, this simplifies to 7 over 20. Other places in Tas was 9 out of 40. 9 out of 40. Giving us a simplest form fraction. That already is in simplest form. Our relative frequency for people born interstate was 10 out of 40, which is equal to 1 out of 4, or 1 in 4. And the relative frequency of people born overseas was 7 out of 40, which again is already in its simplest form. That's calculating our relative frequencies as fractions. Calculate them now as decimals. The way that we do this is we enter the frequency divided by the total number of trials, and we write that as a decimal. So our first one is 7 divided by 20. As a decimal is 0.35. Our next frequency, the relative frequency of people born other places in Tasmania, 9 out of 40, that's 0.225. The relative frequency of people that were born interstate is 0.25. And the relative frequency of people who were born overseas is 0.175. So that's our relative frequencies as fractions. Remember, it's frequency over total number of trials, and then simplified, and our relative frequencies as decimals. Next, we want to look at the total of the relative frequencies, part C. So if we add our relative frequencies together, 7 out of 20 plus 9 out of 40 plus 1 out of 4 plus 7 out of 40. That will give us 40 out of 40, or just 1 whole. We can do the same thing. We try the same thing with our decimals. 0.35 plus 0.225 plus 0.25 plus 0.175. That will give us a relative frequency of 1 as well. Now, they should be the same. Our relative frequency adding up the fractions and decimals should be the same. Sometimes we might get a slightly different answer here if we round off these values. And we might have a rounding error, and this might end up being just less than 1 or just over 1, but it should be exactly equal to 1. Part D of our question says, where is a person selected at random most likely to have been born? Well, let's have a look at the probabilities. There's a 0.35 probability of being born in Hobart, 0.225 probability of being born in other places in Tasmania, 0.25 probability of being born interstate, and 0.175 probability of being born overseas. So the highest probability is Hobart. So that means it's most likely that a person selected at random will be born in Hobart based on the survey that was conducted. Part E says, how many people would you expect out of 100 would you expect to be born overseas? Remember, when we're calculating expected values, we have a formula for that. We have expected number of outcomes is equal to relative frequency multiplied by the number of trials. A fraction of the total number of trials. So expected number of people born overseas is our relative frequency of being born overseas, 0.175. You could use the fraction here or the decimal, both are the same, multiplied by the number of trials. Well, we would be asking 100 people. 0.175 multiplied by 100 will give us 17.5. Now, this isn't really a logical answer because we can't have 17.5 people. So we would need to round that up or round that off. Because it's 17.5, we would round up to the next integer, which is 18 people. So we would expect that 18 people out of 100 would be born overseas based on the relative frequency that we calculated from our survey.